Hello friends, Happy New Year. I am sitting down on the 1st of January with a plan. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to the first reading vlog that I'm planning on doing in 2024. Now, I actually haven't sat down and properly thought about my reading goals or plans for this year, but one thing I do know is that since I started this channel just over a year ago, I have had a tendency to put off reading some books because I think, oh, well, no, because I might read that book for a specific project. And that's fine and okay. But also, I'm looking at my bookcase behind the camera and there are so many books on there that I've just been putting off reading. And I don't want to do that this year. I want to read the books that I'm really excited about. So the theme of this reading vlog is I just wandered up to my bookcase and I grabbed the 4 books on there that I am particularly right now, I just want to read them. So here they are in no particular order. These are, no, I was about to say these were all by authors that I haven't read before, but that's a lie. So the first one is Open Water by Caleb Azumah Nelson. So many people have raved about this book, have said that they think I will really like it. It is a short one. What a good start to the year that would be, to just get a nice quick short book under my belt. This won the Costa Book Prize in 2021, and lots of people absolutely rave about it, although I hate this. Why do publishers do this? I've forgotten the name of it, but I hate it. I want them to stop. But other than that, really looking forward to that one. Then there is a book that I picked up. I think I picked this up at the Bound in Whitley Bay. And this reminds me of, purely in terms of format, How to Be Both by Ali Smith. This is Scary Monsters by Moshfegh Kretser, who's an Australian author. And this book has 2 halves. So this half is written this way around, can you see? And then you flip it over and this, so words failing me. What a good start to the vlog. I promise I may get more articulate later on. But yeah, essentially the book's written in 2 halves and I don't think it matters which way round you read them, but it's like, you either read the green part first or the orange part first. And I think this is a kind of dystopia, but is a lot to do with migration and I think refugee experiences, I think. But I'm really interested in it. I'm very interested in whether or not this is just a gimmick or if this serves the story, and we will discover that in this video. Next up, this is the author that I have read before. I've previously read Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh, but I'm really interested in this one. This is Death in Her Hands, and I have been meaning to read this since I first heard a lot of people talk about it actually, but particularly Jen Campbell on her channel. So what I know about this is that there is a woman who discovers a note in a forest that says something along the lines of, this is Magda, or like, this is the body of Magda, like I didn't kill her or something like that, but there's no dead body there. So it's sort of I found a dead body and I'm trying to work out what to do about that, but there isn't actually a body there, and it's a very unreliable narrator. I'm doing a bad job of pitching it to you, but these are just quick intros. I'll actually read the book later and then we'll know. And the final one, I was so excited about this book when I first heard about it. I even have a signed copy of it. And I don't know why I haven't read it yet, but it's Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Maddie Mortimer. This is giving me all of the exciting layout and topography stuff that the first book of Cuddy gave me last year. And yeah, I'm really excited to get to this one. This, I think, is dealing with terminal illness, along with other things. So a a nice cheery start I'm giving myself to 2024. But, you know, I do know myself as a reader, and I do like to read miserable, depressing things. So here we go. Here's our little stack of the first books that I'm going to read this year, or some of the first books that I'm going to read this year, because I'll probably be reading other stuff at the same time. And I will check in with you when I have done that. You will probably now see some dog walks, or possibly me taking down my Christmas tree. But yeah, I'm going to crack on with these, and I will see you later. Bye. I know. Hello. It's been a little while, not for you, but for me, since I checked in with you. But I've read 2 of the books in that time, and I'll be honest, I've been putting off talking to you a little bit, because I really felt like I owed these books some well considered and well planned reflection, rather than just, you know, doing what I normally do, which is whittering on without a plan. So I do have some notes this time for what I want to say about these books, because I really enjoyed both of them, and I'm having so much appreciation for like the me of a week and a half ago who decided that this was the theme of the vlog, and it has taught me something already about what I want from my reading this year, which is no more delaying. Just get to the books that I'm most excited about reading while I'm excited about reading them. Okay, so the first book, I'm going to go over here to avoid glare. The first book that I read was Open Water by Caleb Azumah Nelson, and this is a really hard book to kind of do a quick pithy summary of, because every kind of one-line description that I could come up with felt like it left a really key element out of the book, because it is at once this incredibly tender and nuanced romance story between 2 young black people in London. It is also a really thoughtful and painful rendering of black masculinity in modern culture. And then it is also an sorry, I've got a really bad cough, so if there's lots of jump cuts in this, it's because I'm cutting out where I'm having coughing fits. But yeah, it is also an absolute and unapologetic celebration of black art and creativity. So there is a lot happening in a book that is this tiny, and it's a debut. honestly. So this book is told in the second person, and we are inside the head of a young man. I don't think it tells you how old he is, but I get 20s vibes, like maybe mid to late 20s, who is living in London. And the book opens with a prologue that we very quickly realise is not actually a prologue, because in that section he already has an established friendship, some form of relationship with this girl. And yet when we get into the book proper, it's the night they meet. So it's sort of establishing right from the start that this book isn't going to have a straightforward chronology. And I think because it's that second person, we really get this sense of being inside his head as he's, because that's the way we live, right? We're in the present moment, but we're constantly thinking of a future time or reflecting on a past time. And that's very much the style and vibe that I got from this book. I'll be honest, right at the start, it wasn't working for me. It took me a little while to settle into it because I felt a little unmoored and a little bit like I couldn't quite grasp what was going on. But I think I was just tired, because when I picked it up again, it all felt like it was falling into place. I do generally not always vibe very well with second person. I think it always takes me a little bit longer to settle into that voice, and that's just like a personal thing. But as I read the book, it just started to make sense. So I mentioned when I described the book kind of 3 separate strands, so I'm going to try and tackle them a little bit individually, because they all interrelate and it's really hard to talk about them all at once without just getting into a brain muddle. So the romance in this, it starts, as I said, there's this prologue where they're in a barbershop, they're kind of friends, but we don't really know what the relationship is. And then it cuts back to the night that they met, and she's actually dating a friend of his. We're just gonna assume that these are them. This book doesn't have any names in, so it's that's why I'm not using names. For once, it's not that I've forgotten, it's that they're not there. He sees her across the room and is just captivated by her, really wants to meet her. But she's actually dating a friend of his, and he goes up to his friend, he's like, can you introduce me to her? I really want to meet her. And then they very quickly hit it off. They become really good friends, partly because they have this shared sort of creative spirit. She's a dancer, he's a photographer and a writer, and they seem to sort of get each other on that very sort of spirit level. It's not like a scandally gossipy book, but she does end up breaking up with his friend, and he does end up not speaking to his friend anymore. But all of that sort of happens in the wings because we're inside his head and he's so wrapped up in her. It's like he's not able to act, to sort of see how it looks from the outside. But the whole book is essentially this very slow burn, will they, won't they, friends to lovers narrative. On the one hand, I was really rooting for them, and even though I just used 3 romance tropes there, slow burn, will they, won't they, friends to lovers, it doesn't feel formulaic at all, and that's because they really feel like fully fleshed out people. I think it was telling that even though this is told in the second person, so we're inside his head, I still felt like I really understood her, because you felt like he really saw her and was sort of deeply invested in trying to understand who she is as a person and how she works. And that was really refreshing to read. That was the kind of romance section. The bit that tackles the sort of lived experience of Black men as they move through the world in the UK and in London specifically, is more prevalent in the latter half of the book. And it begins quite subtly. There's lots of sort of quite vulnerable but also quite brutal descriptions of just what it's like for him moving through the world in a black body. Instances of being stopped and searched, or feeling like people perceive him as a threat and not knowing what to do about that, and how all of that impacts on his own mental health, witnessing gang violence and feeling sort of powerless to stop it is also part of what he's contending with in the book. And the fact that it was in second person really amplified that, because it's second person and we don't know his name. So there's a sort of, he's got this kind of almost anonymous, everyman kind of quality to him, where he's almost like, he could be a stand-in for every black man in London. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, because we don't have a fixed identity for who he is, it's so much easier to see how unfortunately typical that experience probably is. I want to read you a section that just really got me, but it's gonna be quite a long section. So this is from a section just over halfway through, and it's as these sorts of themes are beginning to crop up more. The context for this is that the two of them have just seen the video of George Floyd being killed by a police officer. So like, we're going right in there. She grips your foot with slender fingers, anchoring you in this moment as your voice falters and you begin to slip away. Just a few minutes ago, you'd been seated on her balcony, the air cool as she smoked into the night, a slight flutter of her eyes with every inhale. She suggested you read to her. It had been a while. You pretended to deliberate, scrolling through the document on your phone, despite knowing where your finger would stop the page. You began to read in that clear voice, which you think resembles an old friend telling you a story. You began to read, and you were taken back to the moment the video appeared from across the Atlantic, transferred by the sturdy boat of the internet, how his body crumpled and he fell onto his hands and knees as if crawling. When your voice wavers, it is because you're struggling with the weight of the reality you speak of. You're mad too, because the policemen give each other a warning, like in this video, whereby on seeing an object in a young black man's hand, one of a pair screams to the other, gun, 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 before they both unload, 20 shots in all. You're mad because Stephen and Alton and Michael and you two, received a warning, but you didn't know where or when or how the danger would arrive. You just knew you were in danger. Sorry, I misremembered when I teed you up there about, so he'd written the piece about George Floyd and then they'd seen another incident just then that had reminded him. I think what got me about that bit is this sort of being perceived as being the threat, and just your existence in the body that you're in feeling like justification enough for someone to feel threatened by you to the point that they would do something like that, and how much that must absolutely mess with your head. So I think it was brilliant for that. And then the final part that I want to talk about is maybe the part that I enjoyed most in the book, actually, and that was this sort of sense of it being a real celebration of black art and creativity. It felt like such a love song to so many other black creatives, whether they are visual artists, photographers, musicians, or other authors. There were so many references in this book. There's actually a link in here. Yeah, there's a Spotify playlist of the songs that are mentioned in this book, which I have been listening to. Don't get me wrong, some of them are just they're not my vibe, but some of them I've absolutely fucking loved. There's this sustained reference throughout the book to Northwest by Zadie Smith, which is, I think it's my second favourite Zadie Smith of the ones that I've read. I haven't read everything that she's written. I think On Beauty just edges it for me, but I really, really enjoyed Northwest. And he talks about that a lot. And this book reminded me in the way that it operates and the themes that it discusses of so many things. And I mean that as a real compliment, because it is very explicitly drawing from so many sources. It was actually funny because there were a few moments where I'd be like reading, being like, this reminds me of X. And then like 10 pages later, there would be a direct reference to that artwork. It happened quite a lot with films. It definitely happened with If Beale Street Could Talk and Moonlight, where I was like, this reminds me of If Beale Street Could Talk. And then like lo and behold, like a few pages later, they watched the film adaptation of If Beale Street Could Talk. And Moonlight, it really, really reminded me of Moonlight. I mean, even the title Open Water, just when I hear that title, I picture that scene with Mahershala Ali and the kid in the water. Like, that's where my brain goes when you say Open Water. Oh, we're gonna take a brief interlude here because my window cleaners are here. I love my window cleaners, right? But they literally just hop over my back wall and just they do it in like a team. There's like 5 of them, and they will clean every window on my house front and back in like under 2 minutes. It is absolutely insane. They'll do like my entire street in an hour. And they don't give a fucking shit that I'm recording in this room. He's just looked right at me. I love where I live. Okay, I think we're safe. But I think what I loved was that it didn't feel like intertextuality for intertextuality's sake, or like name dropping for the sake of dropping it in. It was almost like it all fed into that whole everyman experience that I was talking about before, because it's almost as if what Caleb Azumah Nelson is saying is, look how many times we have to tell this story. Like, how many times do we have to sort of lay ourselves bare like this? How many times do we have to show you what's going on before you really see it? And I just thought that was utterly brilliant. I also think it really shows like where his mental health is at. Even though he's a writer, and I mean the character, not the author here, even though he's a writer, he really struggles sometimes to bring himself to articulate what he is actually feeling, especially verbally. And so I think a lot of those intertextual references are also there as a stand-in for him being able to say the words himself. And so in that way, it's also pointing to how important it is that these artworks are there and readily available and accessible to people who might be going through something else, who can use it then to speak to their own pain. You get me? And it just reminded me of so many things, even things that aren't directly referenced. So one is, it reminded me a lot of the classic book, The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin. That book is also written in this very kind of stream of consciousness style. It follows a few different characters. I think they're all men, but it's been a long time since I've read it. But who have come over like the Windrush generation, and it's their sort of early experiences of being in London and having been promised these open doors, and then finding actually that their presence is not this desirable thing that they were told it was going to be. But there was a lot in this book that reminded me of The Lonely Londoners. It also reminded me of a couple of episodes, I mean, kind of the whole Small Axe anthology by Steve McQueen, the film anthology, if you've seen that, but particularly a couple of episodes. So there's one called, it's something to do with Lovers Rock. Is it called Lovers Rock? A large amount of that film, that short film, is it's just kind of like either a house party or something like that, and there's a lot of music going on, and it's very like vibesy, and you're just following people around, and then the story does move on, but I don't want to spoil it for you. But the vibe of that, there's a few scenes in this book where they're in kind of a similar environment, and it just felt very similar. Also, I think the Alex Wheatle episode, in terms of trying to come to terms with experience and using creativity as an outlet for dealing with the pressures of the Black experience in London. It really reminded me a lot of that, and I have a particular soft spot for that book because I've worked with Alex Wheatle before, and he is just like the nicest, most wonderful man. So if you haven't seen Small Axe, watch it because it's brilliant, and the Alex Wheatle episode is perfect. So there we go. That's Open Water, and I've spoken about it for longer than I thought I was going to. Sorry about that. But I had a lot to say about this book. I thought it was brilliant. I can't believe it's a debut book, which is exactly what I also am going to say about this book. How dare this book also be a debut? And I actually, just really depressingly, think these two authors were around the same age when they both published their debut novels. I think they were both like 26, 27, which is just like, as someone in their mid-30s, I don't mind telling you that I resent it. I resent it so much. Yeah, how dare they have written two such good books when I have written 0 books? So this is another book that has so much going on that it's really difficult to come up with like a short intro sentence to kick you off. But this is basically following a woman called Leah, who's in her, I think, 40s, who has just been, or is shortly about to be, this is not a spoiler, it's what the entire book is about, diagnosed with cancer for the second time in her life. So she has already had breast cancer, for which she's had a double mastectomy when her daughter was about 3. So doing some narrative maths in my head, I'm pretty sure her daughter's like a preteen now. So about 9 years later, the cancer's come back, and it comes back really badly. And we know that the cancer's come back before Leah knows that the cancer's come back, because cancer has a voice in this book. So it's told in these really quite short vignettes. So this is like the first bit, there's one bit there, another bit there, and anything that's in bold is sort of, for now, we'll call it cancer's voice for now, although I'm going to discuss in a second why it's more complex than that. But let's kick off with, so cancer's got a voice. So you're getting this alternate narrative alongside these sections that are following predominantly Leah around, but also sometimes her daughter Iris, sometimes her husband Harry. And then you also have that happening alongside this sort of malignant voice of cancer. And it's really interesting, the relationship between those two sections as the book progresses, because at the start, when cancer's talking about Leah, it's almost like colonial, the way they're talking. It's talking, how do you pronoun something like this? Anyway, I feel like I'm not going to be able to describe without reading, so I'm just going to read you the opening section of the book, which is from this perspective. I, itch of ink, think of thing, plucked open at her start, no bigger than a capillary, no wiser than a cantaloupe, and quite optimistic about what my life would come to look like. I have since ached along her edges, delighting in my bare feet floorboard creeps across from where she once would feed, down to where her body brews. I have sampled, splintered, leaked and chewed through tissue, nook, bone, crease and node, so much, so well, so tough now that the place feels like my own. It is, perhaps, inevitable that after all this time I have come to feel a little dissatisfied with the fact of my existence. This is not easy to admit. I suppose one can only be a disaster tourist for so long before the cruel old ennui starts to set in. But the Greeks said that in the beginning there was boredom. The gods moulded mankind from its black, lifeless crust, and this is, of course, encouraging. Today, I might trace the rungs of her larynx, or tap at her trachea like the bones of a xylophone, or cook up or undo some great horrors of my own, because here is the thing about bodies. They are impossibly easy to prowl without anyone suspecting a thing. Unless, of course, they do. And then, of course, they aren't. So there is just so much going on in that section alone. I think you'll appreciate that, like, I could probably talk about this book for 3 hours. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to try and, like, condense the most salient parts. But I think what was fascinating about this, even aside from its construction as just being an incredibly imaginative way to explore illness in the body and bodily experience, was the relationship between the sections. So the vignettes that are following Leah and are, for all intents and purposes, happening in the real world, and then this sort of body space, the parts that are happening in the body space, and the relationship between the two, because it starts as very separate, like that cancer section, I and her, and then as you move through the book, it moves to talking more about our body and we, and it's almost like it's tracking that inevitable change as the cancer progresses through the body and therefore becomes more enmeshed with Leah, as the existence of the cancer becomes more of Leah's lived experience, becomes more of her identity, takes more control. That is then that follows through in the book. Am I making sense? It's so hard to describe. I'm gonna circle back to the cancer voice at the end, because I'm worried that I might have lost you there. And there's also just, I want you to know that aside from that incredibly complex stuff that's going on, there is an awful lot more that this book is doing, and that really, aside from that quite avant-garde, kind of esoteric, some people might say pretentious, and I'm not going to pretend that parts of this weren't pretentious, because they definitely were, but the human story that is being told is utterly devastating. And while I was intellectually interested in the way the story was constructed, and I do think it massively added to it, the fundamental human story that's being told here is just horrible, but brilliant. So in Leah's sections, or the sections that predominantly follow Leah, we're moving quite a lot between past and present. It begins more so with the present day stuff, her dealing with finding out, obviously the incredible heavy emotions that come with finding out that the cancer has returned, and that it has returned in a very big way. Coming to terms with, she's coming to terms with the fact that her daughter she's not going to see her daughter grow up into an adult. She's watching her husband grieving for her while she's still alive, and that is breaking her heart, but also just there's so much going on. But then it's also kind of inevitable that at the end of your life, regardless of how blissfully long or tragically short that life is, it's inevitable that you start looking back. You look back over the years that you've had on the face of this earth, right? And through those reminiscences of her past, we realise how this quite toxic relationship that she had when she was quite young, arguably too young, how much that has impacted her, and how much of that trauma has been sort of looming over her life, really. And for me, those bits were the bits that really got me in the gut, you know. So I need you to know that it's more than just a kind of clever literary conceit, having this sort of cancer voice there, that there is real, true human kind of observation happening in this book. But I said I would come back to the cancer voice, and I will come back to the cancer voice. So at the start, I think we can agree that that opening bit that I read to you, it felt, didn't it, like, or at least it felt to me, I'll not put words in your mouth, like a kind of author constructed voice of cancer, right? So you could kind of be forgiven for assuming that, you know, that is an imagined conceit. We have anthropomorphized cancer, and that it is existing inside the body, and we're getting this narrative where cancer's going around and trying to hide and then trying to like flee from the chemotherapy. That's an actual thing that happens in the book. But actually, as the book progresses, and as we uncover some of those things from Leah's past, and as we learn more about the important relationships in her life, we come to see the body that cancer is working in as more of a metaphorical, well, we begin to see parallels between what's happening in those in the body sections and what's happening in the substantial narrative of the book. And there are these characters that appear in the body that at first we don't know. It's a bit confusing. You kind of like, what's this that cancer's talking to, this sort of imagined other presence in the body. And then you realise as you read the book what those things represent. So the body becomes this metaphorical landscape for addressing and tackling trauma. And I really do think that the way Maddie Mortimer writes is, like, for me, one of the big sells of the book. Yes, the emotional story. For a book that's got such a heavy subject matter, there is so much playfulness and wit and seemingly joy in the writing. You can really feel, it's part of what I love about Ali Smith's writing, actually, that you can feel just the writer's excitement at manipulating and working with language on the page. And that, it's always like, I think it's always nice to read a book where you can feel like that, even though it's a really heavy book, that the author's having fun on the page, that they're getting joy from the experience of writing the book. And some of that wordplay is really explicit. So Leah and Iris play these word games together where they try and come up with like alternate meanings for words and stuff. There's an awful lot of rhythmic, rhyming, poetic devices being used throughout. So just the language as it sits on the page is always interesting. There's always something. I feel like you could study this book. That's why I feel like you could talk about this book for hours and hours and hours. And I promise I'm gonna try and shut up about it soon. There is so much to love, and I do think this is such an impressive debut book. But also, I do think you could tell it was a debut book. Sometimes I felt like those cancer voiced sections took me a little bit too much out of the character world and maybe tried to do like a little bit too much. I think there's that classic thing with a debut novel, isn't there? Understandably, absolutely understandably, but you just want to throw everything at it. You want to kind of show the reader absolutely everything that you can do, and just not often, but there were a few moments throughout where I just was like, oh, I wish she'd just been a little bit more restrained. But that being said, don't get me wrong, if I ever write a novel, I will absolutely 100% be throwing everything but the kitchen sink at it 24/7. So like, Don't let that put you off. I think that's just part of it, isn't it? I also just very briefly wanted to mention like the explorations of motherhood as well as the grief. Motherhood is probably the other big theme that looms really large in this book, and I think it was explored in a really interesting relationship, both through Leah's relationship with her own mother and with her daughter as well. I also think, a bit like Open Water, that I think this is a deeply personal book as well. So it is dedicated to Maddie Mortimer's mum, and I did notice in the acknowledgements that she thanks her dad and her sister. So I think the assumption can be made that Maddie possibly lost her mum quite young. So I think the emotional weight that the author was putting behind this book is really what makes it absolutely stand up. But yeah, I mean, another debut that I can't wait to read. I can't wait to read more by these two. So, oh my God, I've been talking for so long. But I mean, I guess this is what happens when I do reading vlogs about books that I think I'm going to really like, and then I really like them. I just want to talk about them so much. There's so much to say. But I am going to leave it there for now. And I will let you know when I've read the others. I'm a couple of chapters into Death in Her Hands. At the minute, I'm not going to talk to you more about that now. But I might just do another. I'll see how I get on with the other two. But yeah, I will either come to you with an update of 1 or 2. See you in a bit.
This way.
I read the last 2 books, and I'm coming to you straight from Sunday afternoon Percy Pig onesie time. I finished both of these. I've had almost the opposite issue with these 2 as I had with the first 2, because I also finished both of these a good few days ago, and partly I haven't filmed because it's been busy. But also these are 2 books that I don't really have simple thoughts on. So let's get into it. So this, as I said in the start, is the second book by Ottessa Moshfegh that I've read. I previously read Eileen and really liked it, although, I mean, as much as you can like that book, because it's pretty repulsive if you've read it, you know. And I think this book I appreciated more than Eileen, but I don't think I liked it as much. Although it may have something to do with how I read it, which we'll get into in a little bit. But for now, let's do premise. So this book follows Vesta, who is an elderly woman, let's say, who has relocated to this tiny little cabin in the woods in I think like the Rust Belt in America. And she's moved there because her husband has died recently, and so she's kind of up sticks. And and moved, given herself a bit of a change, and she lives there alone with her rescue dog Charlie, and seems to be living out this very repetitive, almost rote, sort of very routine driven, very unvaried life. And the book opens at the point where that existence gets disrupted. And Vesta is walking in the woods and she finds a note. And the first line of the book is in italics, so it's the note. Her name was Magda. Nobody will ever know who killed her. It wasn't me. Here is her dead body. The only snag is that there is no dead body. There's no body there. And what follows in the book is almost like how this one incident then ripples out into Vesta's life. It's told in first person, so we're right there in Vesta's thoughts. We're having the same thoughts that she is having. We're experiencing it all firsthand as she is trying to figure out what this note means. And there are a couple of moments where she briefly considers that it might be a practical joke, but really 100%, pretty much 100% of the time, she is 100% convinced that this note is a real, legitimate thing. And so she wants to find out what happens. And in a lot of ways, it's a book about kind of the brain and imagination and creativity. Vesta goes off to the library. She takes herself off and she researches how to solve a murder, but what she ends up getting is lots of advice on how to write a murder mystery. It's quite sweet. She doesn't really know how to use like a search engine properly, so I think she keeps getting like not quite the results that she actually wants. And so she gets their advice, like, you know, flesh out the characters and work out who the suspects are and start to build a timeline and things like that. And so because she doesn't have anything to go on except for the fact that she found this note, she starts to infill that detail. She starts to imagine not just who Magda was and her whole life. She comes up with a whole backstory for her, but also the boy, as she imagines it to be, who left the note initially, how he may have come by her body, his relationship with Magda, some suspects who may actually have killed her because she doesn't think that it actually was the boy. She believes him in the note. And she fabricates this whole world for herself, or this whole kind of imagined way that things have played out. But at some point, it's like she stops being consciously aware that she's made it up, and she starts, like, she'll meet someone and be like, maybe that was the boy's mum, and you're like, the boy's not real, huh? And on the one hand, that ends up working on like this kind of meta level, because that's what fictional characters are to us as readers, right? We know on one part of our brain is always aware that, you know, these aren't real people, it's not really happening. But on the other hand, with really great writing, you suspend your disbelief, and you do start to feel that these people could be out there in the real world, you know what I mean? And there's actually a moment in the book when Vesta's in the library. It must be maybe about a third of the way through, and she has she's looking up like murder mysteries and that advice that I said, and so this is a piece of advice that she's read. So, create a 3-dimensional world. Your characters should have lives that extend beyond the particular situation. You can use the worksheet for writing character profiles to start bringing the characters to life. Mystery was an artless genre, that much was obvious. Not that the more literary novels I had borrowed from the library seemed any more inspired. What got put on the library shelves was all that stuff that won't surprise you. Blake's invitation, or poem I could call it, wouldn't have made it onto anybody's nightstand. It was too weird. Her name was Magda. What kind of opening was that? An editor would deem the note too dark to publish, too much too soon, they'd say, or it wasn't suspenseful enough, too queer. I tried to remember the openings of the last few books I'd read, and I couldn't. But obviously we know, as the readers of the book, that is the first line of the book that Ottessa Moshfegh has put in. So there's lots of some kind of playful bits going through on that, and you can read it in that way. But then on the more literal side of things, we start to realise as we follow Vesta around that she's not particularly devastated that her husband has died, and that he was a very sort of dominant figure in their marriage, and that she was always made to feel like the intellectual lesser. And so you get the idea that she has maybe been repressing all of this creativity and imagination during their relationship. They've had this whole life together. That almost like what's happening now with her coming up with this whole backstory for Magda is almost like the unleashing of decades and decades worth of repressed brain energy. And actually the impact that the relationship has had on her was one of the parts of the book that I found most interesting throughout it. There's this almost like palpable sense of remorse and almost like grief for a life not lived. Like she feels like she's wasted her existence on this man who was having affairs. He was like an intellectual, like an academic, and was pretty obsessed with himself. He sounds like a bit of a dickhead. And there's a few moments, she says, like, since his death, I'd grown to be more poetic. Too much magic is dashed by cold logic, and I had to acquiesce, let him outshine me to keep the peace. And so that's also kind of what's going on. So it's kind of working on those two levels. And then as the narrative progresses, Vesta becomes increasingly paranoid, almost like she's imagining too much now. And as readers, you think that's what's happening. You think, oh, like too much imagination, you know, she's sort of painted herself into a bit of a corner with it. But then some things happen that don't seem like she has imagined them, or that they're just a result of paranoia. So you're kind of going, oh, maybe this is actually happening. And the thing with Ottessa Moshfegh, particularly in this book, I think, is that she is not a writer who is at all interested in tying up loose ends or in explaining to you what she's doing. Like she's not here for that. And I thought the end of this book was really challenging, actually. Like there definitely wasn't like a sense of catharsis at the end, and it really does build in tension, particularly in the final sort of 20-30 pages. And I feel like the ending was symbolic of something, but I can't work out what it was symbolic of. So if you have read this and you have some theories, drop them in a comment down below, but just like don't ruin the book for people. So if you are going to do that, do like spoiler for death in her hands and then hit return a bunch of times and then put your theory in. So I definitely found the writing and the narrative much more effective for me in the latter half of the book. It took me quite a while to get into it, and it took me quite a long time to read, even though it's not really a long book. It's barely over 250 pages. But I think it's not written in real time, obviously, but I'm pretty sure it's only a few days. So you're getting quite a lot of the literal time is moving quite slowly in the novel. And I think this is a book that would benefit from a more immersed reading experience than I was able to afford it this time. Like I was reading it like quite piecemeal, like a chapter here and then like a chapter the next day, and I don't know if that is necessarily the best way to to read this book. I think if I'd read it on like 2 Sunday afternoons where I had like a chunk of time to really get into it, that would have made my reading much more, I would have enjoyed it much more, I think. So on the whole, I appreciated a lot of what it was doing, and like I said, some of the themes and stuff, particularly that, like, it really got me, that bit where she was talking about feeling like her life had been wasted, and that sort of remorse that you can have at the end of your life for things that you haven't done, and that regret. And I thought that was really interesting. So I do recommend it if it sounds like your cup of tea. It is very, like I say, very open-ended, very open to interpretation. So in that way, I think it could make a really interesting like book club book. And yeah, I did not enjoy the ending of this book because something happens that I found really upsetting, but I'm not gonna spoil it, obviously. But yeah, so that was Death in Her Hands. And I think I have similar sorts of feelings about Scary Monsters by Michelle de Kretser, which I also really appreciated for what it was doing on an intellectual level, but I didn't find myself in the reading experiences of either of these books particularly compelled to pick the book back up again. So yeah, but we'll get into it. So as I said at the start of the video, this is a book that is comprised of 2 distinct halves, and they are almost identical in length. One is 153 pages and the other is 152 pages. So they almost completely balance each other out in the book, and it's been printed so that you can read it in either order. They are 2 stories, or 2 narratives really, of migrant experiences. I think I said in the intro that I thought they were refugee experiences. They weren't, they're migrant experiences from 2 different time periods. So one in France, partially in Paris, in the 1980s, and one in a near future in Australia. So I started with the green side, which is Lily's story. Lily is a young woman who, when she was a teenager, her family migrated from an unspecified Asian country to Australia, and now Lily is working in France as an English teacher. So she's got kind of 2 layers of migration to her story. Her narrative is quite loose in terms of plot. I mean, they both are really, but Lily's for me was the looser of them. It's very much a sort of coming of age, but like the coming of age in your early to mid 20s rather than like, you know, at the start of adolescence. But she's figuring out who she is as a person. In parts, it reminded me a bit of Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, although the characters in this are obviously older. In particular, there's Lily's relationship or friendship with someone that she meets there, which reminded me quite a lot of Elena Ferrante. It also reminded me a bit of, if you've read, is it the Children of Violence series? It's the Doris Lessing series of books that begins with Martha Quest. So yeah, it's probably not read. It reminded me in parts of Doris Lessing's writing, in terms of there's not much happening. You are just sort of following her and these relationships, and it feels a little unmoored, and I'll talk about that later when we talk about how the 2 sides come together, because I think that is intentional. But she's having her first sort of political awakenings, and as that's happening, it's kind of compounded with experiencing some microaggressions. She is a brown woman in France at the time. There is an awful lot of anti-Algerian rhetoric, but also just behaviour being demonstrated by French people. And even though she's not from Algeria, she's feeling this sort of kinship with the Algerian people who are living in France. And so you've got that kind of going on in the background. And there's also some literal threats of violence. We're coming up to, and forgive me, I'm not very good on my sort of more recent French history, but there's a big election coming up, and there's kind of rumblings that it could be quite revolutionary, but it also could be quite violent if it doesn't go the way that the people want it to go. And also it's mentioned a few times that this is the time that the Yorkshire Ripper was sort of running around in England, and it mentions when he's captured, but there's also kind of some paranoia that there might be someone doing something similar in France, and particularly targeting migrant women. So that's kind of the vibe of it, and it all just kind of is gently simmering in Lily's section. And then in the second for me part, although you could read this one first, and actually I would be so fascinated to speak to someone who has read this book in the other order, because I think when you do that, it can really colour what you pick up in the next section. But Lyle is living in, as I said, a near future Australia, and him and his wife are also were originally from a country in Asia, unspecified again, and are living in Australia, have been for a long time, have put an awful lot of effort into assimilating to that culture, and have really almost cut ties with anything that might connect them to their former culture and identity. And I said at the start that I thought this was a dystopian book. So the elements of dystopia that come in Lyle's section. So in this version of Australia, there is we understand that the climate has worsened quite significantly, and that there are now whole parts of Australia that are essentially no-go zones, including like a big part of, I've forgotten if it's Melbourne or Sydney, but it's either Melbourne or Sydney that basically are like uninhabited now. They've fallen into the sea. There's like fires going on in other parts pretty much permanently. So what that means is more people are being concentrated into other areas, and there's elements of ghettoization that are coming, although Lyle and his wife are very comfortably middle class, so they're a little bit insulated from that. And to top it all off, Australia has instigated a policy, or basically like a don't ask, don't tell on the climate, where you can be criminally prosecuted for criticising Australia's stance on the climate, which is basically to stick their head in the sand and pretend that nothing is going on. So like we find out their son is an environmentalist, and we find out, particularly through conversations that he has with his family, that whole swathes of the barrier, I mean already whole swathes of the barrier reef have gone, but it's got much worse. But you can't take pictures of anything that implies that the climate emergency in Australia is happening. So there's definite dystopian vibes happening, and how that is enacted in the lives of Lyle and his wife are really interesting. So the government sort of we find out about these potential solutions to this issue of overcrowding. And the first one is that they've instigated a much more rigorous repatriation policy for Australian citizens who have migrated from other countries. So they're basically, you could be repatriated for any kind of slight infringement. And obviously for a family like Lyle's that have done the absolute most they can to integrate, to sort of cast off their migrant identity, they consider themselves to be Australian, that is a very scary prospect for them. And also the other thing is that a policy of almost like voluntary euthanasia that is being targeted at the elderly population. So not people who are terminally ill, not people who particularly want to end their lives, but almost a policy of they've had their time, they're taking up space. Maybe you should consider asking grandma to euthanize herself. And Lyle's mother is living with them. And so there are conversations that are happening about those things. So there's definitely, I felt like the themes of Lyle's story were much more overt and acute than in Lily's. But on the whole, I didn't really enjoy reading the section from Lyle's perspective and following Lyle's family. And I think that was a little bit intentional. They are so unlikable. The things they are saying and doing and considering feel so absolutely like reprehensible to me that it was really difficult to get on board with the narrative in lots of ways, even though I was really interested in how the author was exploring these ideas. I found like how much I disliked them both a bit problematic. I think it was intentional in that she's exploring almost like the dangers of assimilating and how much of yourself you can lose when you do that. But yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot. So let's talk about the scary monsters then, because this kind of tees us up perfectly. Because there are lots of scary monsters in this book, and they emerge in different ways. So there is absolutely, through both of them, racism, xenophobia, this sort of anti-migrant attitude, this isolationism attitude that kind of permeates through, also misogyny, and then particularly in Lyle's section also then ageism as well, which reminded me a little bit of Vesta at points, because she talks about people just seeing her as like this useless old woman. So there's that, and then there's obviously the more acute threats of Lyle's narrative and what's happening there. But really, I think that almost like under all of those pressures, because some of them are acute and some of them are pervasive, and through all of those pressures that people are undergoing, particularly in this case, the different experiences of people who've migrated between countries and are sort of living between countries almost. This idea that under all of those pressures, we become the scary monsters ourselves, and we are able to, with enough conditioning, take something that should be abhorrent to us and feel like that is normal. So in one sense, it reminded me a little bit of Prophet's Song as well. I compared it at the start of this video to Ali Smith's How to Be Both, which, to be fair, is maybe in some ways it's an unfair comparison for me to make, because How to Be Both is one of my favourite books of all time. But in that book by Ali Smith, there's two narratives again, and that it's not published in this format where you can kind of choose your own adventure. It's either you buy a copy that has it with a contemporary story and then a historical, or you buy a version that has the historical and then the contemporary. But those two narratives were quite clearly linked together. There was a very clear kind of like bridge between those. The links on the whole in this were much more thematic, and I think obviously showing, I think, the small and acute and personal signs of what might be coming in Lily's story, and then where we might be going, and this idea of moving from the idea that this could happen in an ordinary person's lifetime, so someone growing up in the 80s and someone in the not too distant future. I think that was very clever in terms of the chronology, and even like just the way it's printed in terms of you're moving towards the middle, and both of the narratives have this sense of just stopping. Like there's a dislocation where they meet each other and you don't actually get a satisfying resolution to either story. And again, a bit like the Ottessa Moshfegh, I think that is intentional, even if it does make it quite a frustrating reading experience. But then there was a moment in the Lyle narrative, like this really throwaway line that linked the two stories in a way that it was really jarring, and I think felt it does explain why the two exist here, but for me just felt a little bit tenuous. I don't know. I'd be fascinated if you've read this. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, because I appreciated so much about this book in terms of what it was exploring thematically, and also at the writing on a sentence level, craft level, is like absolutely beautiful. There was a line that I remember in Lyle's section, someone is described as being transparent with anger and the effort to control it. And I thought, oh, that's so good. And then there's this section in whose side am I on, Lily? Yeah, there was this bit where Lily is with her friend, who the one where it reminded me of the Elena Ferrante, and it says, sprawled on the floor beside her, eating Belgian chocolates from a box, I thought, this moment now, this is happiness. However long I live, I'll never be as happy again. A faint, pleasurable ache came over me, a nostalgia for the present. And like, just like moments like that, I'm like, oh, that is like lovely and beautiful. So it's like, I had sort of the same problem with both of them, and like, I got it intellectually, I appreciated it, I thought the writing was really good, I just didn't find myself, it didn't lure me in, and I wasn't like hooked to it. But like I said, I have, particularly for the latter part of this reading vlog, like work's been really busy, we've just had a bit more stuff going on, so it could also be that I wasn't quite able to devote big enough chunks of time to reading these books that I think they really deserve. But definitely a lot to admire. So on the whole, although I think I definitely preferred my reading in the earlier part of this vlog, all of these authors are ones that I will go to. Again, they are all people whose books I will look out for in the world, because I think there is a lot to like and admire. So I'm thrilled to report that this has really worked. Who would have thought that I have quite a good reading time when I just read what I feel like reading? It's fascinating, isn't it? God, revelation after revelation over here. So do let me know in a comment down below how your reading is going in January. Do you suffer from the same ailment as I do in terms of putting off reading books that you think you're really going to enjoy for one reason or another? And if you do, I'd love to know what reason you give yourself. And yeah, if you've enjoyed this video, then do click the like button and subscribe to my channel if you would like. It would be lovely to have you around for future ones. I might actually just do this once a month, and at the start of the month just go up to my bookcase and do 3 or 4 more books that I'm excited to get to that month. That might be a fun way of doing things. I've been whittering on for absolutely ages, and I'm gonna let you go. Enjoy your day, and see you soon, friends. Bye.